have started it. Great. All right, so today's webinar is about virtualization. You probably have been hearing a lot about virtualization, and if you've been reading our blogs of late, you'll note that we've been trying to go through it with gummy detail about what is virtualization, what the advantages are, and really where virtualization is headed. So today what we're going to do is kind of take all of that and bring it all together. We're going to give you a quick overview of virtualization, give you a few of the key terms that are used on a regular basis, then talk about the advantages, give you a little bit into the capacity planning. Capacity planning becomes a little more of an issue when you start doing shared resources, so it's something that everybody needs to be aware of. And finally, we will talk about what's the difference between a hosted environment like Amazon or Azure versus doing on-premise virtualization. So that'll be the last topic that we go through. So, quickly starting on an overview, what exactly is virtualization? Well, basically what it does is it creates what are called virtual machines, and it'll actually allow for individual virtual machines to exist on a single physical server. There are some terms that you have to be aware of. There is the host, and that is typically the server and possibly even the OS that server is running on. There is also what's known as the hypervisor. That hypervisor actually controls all the virtual machines within that physical server space. And then there's the guest, and that's typically the software or the app or the OS that runs inside the virtual machine. Now, when we get into the advantages, you'll see that this allows for better utilization of that physical server. But in other cases, if you're not careful, one virtual machine can monopolize the resources within the server and cause problems for the other virtual machines. So when we get into the capacity planning, this will become a little more prevalent as to why you have to pay attention to this. Now, there are two types of hypervisor. There is one, type 1, where the hypervisor actually controls the environment, if you will. It works with the host physical hardware, and then what happens is the hypervisor creates the individual virtual machines. So this diagram on the left is a type 1. In this particular case, if we were on a type 1 hypervisor, we would actually have a Windows OS in the virtual machine and then run Windows OS for a server, 2016 or 2012 is generally what we're using today. And then the HG platform would sit on top of that and operate independently. Now, type 2 actually has a native operating software system in it. For example, it might be a physical server that's running on Linux, and then on top of Linux would be the virtualization software, which would then control each of the individual virtual machines. One of the advantages of a type 2 hypervisor is if you actually have a platform or an app that actually runs on that native operating system, you actually can literally place the virtual machine at the native operating, or within the native operating system, and the virtualization software does the controlling of the Okay, so whoever was at 1562, Alicia, that was your music for you, by the way. Just so, I've muted you, so we should be able to move forward. So let's go on. Now, when we talk about virtualization software, there's a lot of different kinds. There's VMware, which everyone is pretty much what we're used to, and that's been deployed within a customer on-prem environment, and our software's been deployed on it. There's also KVM, OpenStack. EC2 is another virtualization environment that's done by Amazon, which we've actually deployed on. There's Azure, Hyper-V. Hyper-V by Microsoft, we're not certain. We think we may have been deployed within a Hyper-V environment. We just, because we don't necessarily have all the information that an IT department has put together, we're not always clear as to what it is. And then there's Zen Server and VirtualBox, as well as obviously bare metal, which is an on-prem environment. The thing that is important to remember is that we don't necessarily have to integrate with the management APIs, the HYPERVISOR APIs. We just literally live in our own little virtual machine, and we operate within our environment based on the Windows Server OS APIs that would be inside that virtual machine. The obvious exception to that is bare metal. When it's a physical server with PCI slots, then we actually, the Windows Server OS and the APIs, we actually interact with. Things that also you need to be aware of with these virtualization software is that very few of them actually interact with analog or digital tap cards. When you're in these VM environments, VoIP is the best way to go. Now, that being said, we are introducing a new product called a remote acquisition device for CEC that will take the analog or digital information and recording and actually convert it into IP, allowing it to be transferred into a host, a main directory, or a database, or storage that might be in a hosted environment. So it's something that, while we're doing the basics for some small applications, we're looking at down the road potentially the RAD being a key portion of our virtualization deployment when we get into more hosted environments. Now, that also being said, we have one episode we know of now that we are actually operating on the Azure platform, and that's with the Mayo Clinic. We recently learned about this. We are looking into how it's being deployed, what's being used. Word on the street is they're actually using screen capture within this, which is something we can't do in the Amazon environment, or at least in most cases with the Amazon environment because of firewall restrictions that a customer might have. But there is also the opportunity to, as we move forward, it'll give us another area where we'll actually have more support for virtualization software. And that, again, would be another hosted environment. Now, when you get into the advantages of virtualization, one of the biggest areas that works for us is hardware utilization. And what happens here is that when you use virtual machines and you can optimize the use of each application within its virtual machine, you can actually put more apps on one physical server, which means in terms of consolidation. So you're able to potentially shoehorn, crowbar, or vice grip more applications within a individual server. The reason that a lot of people look at this is that oftentimes they initially put in the app with its own server and another app with its own server. Neither one of those servers are running at full capacity or full capability. They realize they can reduce a server and then put everything on one, so that's why they introduce the virtualization for hardware utilization. The other piece of the puzzle is it actually saves on physical space. So if you have less servers, then you have less racks that you need to put in place in the room, in the data room. Saves you on ancillary costs, electricity, air conditioning, etc. So hardware utilization is one of the big advantages of doing virtualized environments. The other big, what I consider to be the big advantage is the ability to do distributed resources. Now, let me give you an example. Let's say that you want to make sure that you have systems up all the time. So you may have on one physical server a primary app, let's say application 1 on virtual machine 1. But then you have a backup to that app that would be mirrored or replicated or however you want to accomplish it on a second physical server. And then the second app is actually on that second physical server, the primary, and then the backup's on the second one. So if you ever lose a physical server, you're actually able to recover, replicate, and move on. Now, a lot of people go, well, if they're in the same building, that doesn't really matter. Well, we do have a particular customer that's actually doing this where one set of resources is on the East Coast and the other set of resources is on the West Coast. So they're actually able to fully have full disaster recovery, full replication capabilities. So if one system goes down, the other system operates, and they're able then to backfill all the information off from our recordings back to the other one, so they don't lose anything. So that distributed resources is a huge piece of the puzzle that has an advantage within virtualization. Obviously, if you're in an environment where there's a lot of growth, whether it be data growth or computing processing growth, the virtualization actually allows you to provide two types of flexibility and scalability. One is horizontal, where you scale out. So you can add more hardware, more storage, you link it back, you continue to multiply because you have a fast-growing environment. One of the things that for us, for our platform, as we add more ability to capture other types of data, our storage requirements may grow faster than our processing requirements, in which case we can virtualize and add more storage capabilities, and that allows us to actually allow the system to grow without having to continually add core capabilities. So it helps the customer save money. Or you may want to do vertical virtualization, in other words, scale up. In this case, it may be you need to add more memory, more bandwidth, or more CPU cores. And in this particular case, when you have, let's just say you have multiple virtual machines on that particular physical server, and you know that one virtual machine only is used once a week and the processing is not real high, then that other virtual machine, you can bring all the physical resources, the bandwidth available, the memory, the CPU cores, to be used more so on that virtual machine that's actually growing. So in this case, the vertical virtualization, where you can scale up, allows you to address things that are growing. Now, with regards to flexibility on this, what goes up can come down. So if over time you see that the resources are not needed, you can actually scale back a virtual machine to fit the need and take all those excess resources and put them onto something else. This is all part of what goes into the capacity planning, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. The other advantage is cost savings. That one's pretty obvious. When you look at, we actually put this up in one of our blogs, when you look at the 3-year total cost of ownership, when you go to virtualization, you have lots of savings, whether it's on reduction in the number of software licenses that you need, whether it saves on network costs in terms of not having to have multiple ports, not having to have multiple bandwidth allocations. Obviously, hardware reduction is a cost savings, so that tends to be a capital savings if you're doing multiple year depreciation. The auxiliary costs go down if you have less hardware used, then you have less ancillary costs. And of course, in many cases, by not having to have multiple physical servers, you can potentially have less staff to have to be focused on just maintaining physical servers, and instead having them be able to be involved with making sure the applications are working right, having them more involved with things that are good to the business core of the business rather than just tending to physical servers. So with all those advantages, obviously there are some give and takes everywhere, and that's where capacity planning becomes a crucial feature. Now, with capacity planning, it's a bit like Vulcan chess. So it's multidimensional. There are a lot of different things that you have to deal with. For example, in our particular case for our platform, because of the requirements to be up and have a lot of real-time recording going on, it's easier in the virtualized environment if we have dedicated resources within that. So you dedicate a certain number of resources. You don't allow for a lot of sharing. But in other cases where you may have less critical applications running together on a physical server, you may go with all shared resources, and they may share between what they want. And obviously, as I mentioned before, it's your application and service requirements that play a big role in determining exactly how you want to set up the system, how you want to be able to flex the systems, how you want, you examine everything as you need today, and then also you look at what your long-term capacity might be, and then you use that to determine how much resources you give each virtual machine within a physical server. And obviously, when you look at that, keeping track of that and doing a lot of usage monitoring becomes a big deal. And there are a lot of capabilities out there that can alarm when a particular application is using too many resources and it may be impacting something else. It adds a layer of complexity, but then again, the cost savings associated with virtualization, that level of complexity, is, as long as it's automated, is well worth that cost versus the value, the benefit of having a lot more flexibility and saved overall cost from, say, hardware. So virtualization on-prem, everyone is aware of, and it was from that virtualization on-prem that really brought about the idea of hosted environments. And the one area where we've actually have an application running for a large financial services company is on the AWS global infrastructure. Now, a lot of people say, well, there's security issues, and my data's not on my site, and I'm concerned about that. And those are all very real concerns that people have. On the flip side, though, if you're in an environment where you're bringing new capabilities or you want a lot of redundancy, geographical redundancy, if you want to be able to have multiple capabilities or you want to be bringing on new capabilities, going to somewhere like AWS is not such a bad thing, right? So you think about it, there's multiple regions. They have edge locations that tend to be very, very close to where most customers are. They have availability zones throughout the world. And then they have these foundation services like the EC2, which is a computing platform, or providing different storage capabilities or networking or database. And then they actually provide more application services that sit on top of that you can actually take advantage of. Then there's also the monitoring. They provide all sorts of identity and access capabilities. They have all the management capabilities that can sit on top of that. And then your application sits on top of all of that. So, the question of security, there are a lot of people that still think having their system on-prem behind their firewall is the best way to protect their data. The reality is that what malware and ransomware vendors are doing now is they actually are chasing smaller companies or smaller users, such that they are the ones that are being targeted, because they know that the large companies or the people that have hosted their applications are protected by, like AWS, which has lots of experts that take care of that. So it's from our standpoint, as HigherGround moves forward, we see the virtualization taking hold in a lot of places, but we also see hosted being the way of the future. And certainly the way we are approaching everything is the ability to adapt to these hosted environments as fast and as well as we can, so that we continue to provide opportunities for growth, not only for our platform but also for our customers. So I know we went through this fairly quick. This is basically an overview of everything that we've been presenting starting back in September, and then the blog will go through the end of the month. I highly encourage, if you want to know a little bit more, we read the blogs. In many cases, the blogs have links to other resources that will allow for more information to be collected, so that you have a very good feel for how all this operates. But at this point in time, because we want to be respectful of everyone's time and their efforts, are there any questions? Please feel free to bring up any questions at this point. Okay, hopefully this gave you an idea of a little quick idea about what virtualization is, and then a little bit about where HigherGround is heading with both virtualization and hosted environments. Thank you for joining us today. As we pointed out, we are recording this, and we will be posting this on the partner portal for review. We'll also, the presentation itself will be posted, so that you'll be able to download that for future reference if you wish. If you have a customer that wants to talk about virtualization, please feel free to use this presentation. It is easily used as a consumable device for any sort of presentations. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. I can get you more details about anything you might have, or if you need background for any of the charts, be glad to give that to you. And with that, unless someone has a question, thank everyone for coming today and listening to our quick virtualization webinar. I will say we have some ideas for future webinars, but we haven't solidified those yet, so those we'll be working on, and as soon as we get something sorted out on that, we will be sure to let everybody know, and we will be glad to do it again and again. It's just a great opportunity for us to give you the information you need to make sure that you're ready to go out there in the world. All right. And again, thank you for joining. And
thank you, Tom.
We'll be stopping the sharing, the recording now.